I shall begin by introducing my partner, who's not here today, Dr. Edward Town, who is currently working as a postdoctoral research fellow on the Reformation to Restoration project at the Yale Centre for British Art in New Haven. Ed worked at the gallery on the Making Art in Tudor Britain project, and he published a biographical dictionary of London painters in the Walpole Society in 2014. So, Roland Lockie, the mysterious Roland Lockie, was a goldsmith and picture maker. He was born in the parish of St Bride, Fleet Street, in around 1566, the son of the armourer Leonard Lockie. He was apprenticed to Nicholas Hilliard for 8 years, starting on 29th of September 1581, and was made free before 1592. He was commended for oil and limning in some measure by Richard Haydock in the preface to his translation of Lamazzo in 1598, and he was included in a list of artists who were proficient in the use of dry colours in Edward Norgate's Miniatura. The National Portrait Gallery's portrait of Thomas More's family and descendants, a late 16th century copy and update of Holbein's famous portrait, was commissioned by Thomas More the Younger. And the attribution derives from the fact that the painting was seen in Lockie's studio by the antiquary William Burton, who said, and I quote, "Roland Lockie, one whom I knew very well when he lived in Fleet Street, who was both skillful in limning and in oilworks and perspectives, at whose house I once saw a neat piece in oil, containing in one table the picture of Sir John Moore, a judge of the King's Bench in the time of Henry VIII, and of his wife, and of Sir Thomas More, Lord Chancellor, his son and wife, and of all the lineages heirs male descended from them, together with each man's wife until that present year living." So this portrait provides a fascinating means to discuss the copies after Holbein's portrait that were being produced in the late 16th century in the context of contemporary portraiture. We analysed a number of copies after Holbein as part of the Making Art in Tudor Britain project and found that they were the product of different studios. We haven't examined the More family portrait in detail, but in the future it would be interesting to consider in relationship to these other portraits after Holbein, and then in relation to other works by Lockie, as and when attributions may appear. But to have ostensibly the work of both styles within one painting provides an incredibly useful reference point, particularly considering Lockie's work as a copyist. The portrait also provides a fascinating glimpse, you may have missed her in the kind of upper right corner, of another area of Lockie's portraiture, the production of copies after portraits by lesser-known artists. So Anne Cressica, so I'll just go back, there she is on the wall behind, is depicted both in the copy of the original Holbein and in this portrait on the wall. So we have kind of three styles of portraits occurring within this one image. Other works that have been associated with Lockie are the two portraits inscribed Rolandus Lockie, the version of the More family portrait at Nostell Priory, and the portrait of Margaret Beaufort at St John's College, Cambridge. The inscription in the Nostell Priory painting is a later addition, and the stylistic similarity and relationship to the gallery version has been questioned and discussed by David and by Jane Eade in an article in Apollo that I can wave around if anybody is interested. But it's interesting that the name uses the Latinised form in both the Lockie and the Margaret Beaufort and the Nostell Priory portraits. There's kind of the common thread to the inscription that's interesting. And there's also the miniature of the More family portrait in the V&A, which was first linked to Lockie by Roy Strong on the grounds that he was renowned as a limner. So you have this large-scale version, this small-scale version. He is the one person who may have been capable of doing both. But that said, given Lockie's reputation at the time, it seems remarkable that there aren't more paintings attributed to him. As I said, he was trained by Hilliard, and the documentary evidence suggests that he was successfully working as an artist at a time when court portraiture was dominated by Marcus Geertz the Younger and John de Critz the Elder, and he seems to be kind of holding his own very well. Another kind of glimpse of Lockie can perhaps be seen in the work of the artists he trained in the years after he became free in 1592. And these included Richard Greenbury, his brother Nicholas Lockie, to whom he left all his Italian prints in his will, John Langton and Ralph Blackmore, and Ed's written more about these individuals in the biographical dictionary. But I just wanted to bring up these paintings again to think of the kind of lineage that Lockie was connected into. In the payments, it's in the payments in relation to Hardwicke Hall and the Talbot and Cavendish families that Lockie leaves perhaps his most significant traces in the archival record. And it therefore seems most likely that it's in this picture collection, as was now disseminated into sort of various places, that further examples of Lockie's work are to be found. On 24th of July, 1592, 2 payments totalling £3 were made by Elizabeth, Countess of Shrewsbury, to Hilliard for drawing of one picture, while the following payment in her accounts of 40 shillings was made to Rowland for the drawing of one other. And these are kind of small sums of money that don't suggest kind of large-scale works. In August 1609, Bess's son, William Cavendish, paid £3 6 shillings 8 for making the pictures, 40 shillings for 12 ells of canvas for pictures at 3 shillings 4 pence the ell, and £10 in part payment of a bill for drawing 15 pictures. In October, Lockie was paid £15 in full for drawing 16 pictures that had been paid for him in London and another payment in the country. And in September, there were payments to porters that brought pictures from Mr. Lockie. And Lockie himself was paid £8 for Mr. Cavendish's picture, My Lady's Grace, and my Lordship's first wife, for canvas and gilding all the frames of the pictures made at Hardwicke according to his bill. And also to kind of also contextualise the types of works that we're looking for. We have not only the kind of Moore family portrait for reference, but also the fact that the Talbots were discerning patrons, standing amongst, and a letter from John Talbot of Grafton to his cousin George Talbot, Earl of Shrewsbury, on the 7th of July 1597, provides one of the few sort of descriptive references of the appreciation of a portrait that had been presented as a gift from this period. And he wrote, "I most humbly thank you for the picture that you have sent unto me, amongst many other infinite favours. Surely he hath been much beholden to the painter, for gracing him with long tufts in his neck and curling of his hair, before after the best art like fashion he lacketh nothing but a great pair of ruffs." So, to some of the Hardwicke paintings that have been associated with Lockie at various points, but none of which are straightforward. And so David's been talking about Mary Queen of Scots, and Cash is going to talk about James, but just to, he's been known to be associated with Hardwicke, but it's difficult to pin down exactly which things he was doing. So for Mary Queen of Scots, Lockie was evidently involved in the production of portraits of Mary Queen of Scots, and this is entirely appropriate because, as David showed, the portrait type, the likeness of the Queen, is associated with a miniature by Nicholas Hilliard. And so it's very plausible that Lockie, his pupil, would have had access to a likeness to be able to create portraits of the Queen that were kind of particularly in demand after James's accession. And there are payments in January 1610 to Mr. Lockie's man for going with the Queen of Scots picture to my Lord Arundel's and 2 porters to carry it. Then on the 21st of June 1613, 2 shillings was paid to Lockie's men who brought the Scotch Queen's picture, and £9 was given for the picture itself. But this portrait is difficult to track down because it was presented to the Lord Privy Seal, Henry Howard, 1st Earl of Northampton, who in his inventory had at least 4 portraits of Mary, so it kind of went into this collection of portraits of Mary. Similarly, another area that's kind of a little more difficult to unpick, the portraits that Catherine's going to talk a bit more, but these have been both associated with Lockie at kind of various points in a sort of like, oh, they're large on canvas and should be Lockie, but it all gets a bit more complicated. So Ed and I decided instead to consider the works that were listed in the payments to Lockie, looking for images of Sir William Cavendish in the Hinds Archive. So this portrait at Welbeck shows the sitter in dress of 1609, so this is the date at which the portraits were commissioned. From Lockie, you have the very handy kind of cross-reference in terms of dress to the portraits of James I by John de Critz. And it doesn't, whilst this is obviously working from black and white photograph, I have not seen the painting, so, you know, at that layer of interpretation, they're not kind of completely disparate items. They are plausibly things that could sit in the same world. So this is a detailed portrait from the family of Thomas More the Younger. And Ed very kindly put together this very complicated family tree of Cavendish Talbot links, but it does end up, as you can see at the bottom, Duke of Portland at Welbeck. So there's very plausible reasons why a portrait of Cavendish could end up at Welbeck at a later point. But, you know, very much more to be done considering that portrait. There is also a payment in December 1612 for a portrait of Sir William Maynard, who married William Cavendish's daughter Frances. In the Hinds Archive, we have only one image of William Maynard, But again, very interestingly, it is of a portrait of exactly the right date, sort of for 1612. Nice comparative there with the Richard Sackville, 3rd Earl of Dorset, in terms of kind of rough shapes. So it's a plausibly portrait of the right date, presuming that it is the right sitter, sold at Sotheby's in 74. And again, not working from a black and white photo of a very damaged painting, but nonetheless, you could see how it would be worth investigating further to see if there is a relationship to the portraits this time of the young Cressida Moore in the Moore family portrait. In relation to the 1609 portrait of my Lordship's first wife, it's perhaps interesting to consider the portrait that's identified as possibly Anne Keeley. And even though this identification of the sitter as Anne Keeley is in relation to a portrait that's in the 1601 inventory, so the two bits of information can't match up. But it's intriguing that she married Cavendish in March 1581 and had clearly died by 1609 because the payment to Lockie is for a portrait of your first wife and the current lady's grace. So Lockie's portrait that he produced in 1609 would have had to be in a copy of a portrait that was likely produced between 1581 and 1609. And this portrait is of kind of particular interest. Ed and I kind of flagged it up because it is on canvas. Unlike the other works in the collection from the 1590s, such as the Mary Cavendish that you can see. So that this is of kind of the bits of information that you can link together. So while the research undertaken as part of Making Art in Tudor Britain has shown that the default assumption that paintings on canvas date from the 17th century is not kind of correct, the fact that there are payments made to Lockie for canvas, for painting, means it's a crucial factor to take into consideration when assessing which works by him may survive within the collection. So as a kind of 1590s portrait of a woman that's on canvas, I think interesting to consider. It also brings into consideration this portrait of an unknown man, which is very compositionally similar to works by Robert Pete the Elder, shows a sitter from the 1590s. So is this another copy commissioned by Cavendish? And the thing with Lockie to kind of have to unpick is how do you discern an artist's hand when you're working from copies? Kind of what are you assessing? But the payment for 9 ells of canvas means it'd be fascinating to use this group of portraits as a case study for the comparative analysis of canvas weave from X-rays, which has proved successful at linking canvas supports from paintings to similar bolts of cloth. So using the X-rays to then have kind of, the data analysis to see if there are any canvas links across the group. And finally, I just wanted to conclude with if you're using the other portraits in the Moore family as a kind of point of reference as to what Lockie's wider oeuvre may have been, it opens up the idea of assessing portraits in other collections. Ed has been looking closely at the work, the group identified by Strong as unknown follower of Giertz in the English Icon, and bringing kind of other paintings into consideration. And among these is this portrait of an unknown man from the collection in Bolton, which again does seem to sit in a plausible way with the Thomas Moore, the younger, from the large-scale family portrait. And so the research for this is very much in the kind of early stages of opening up consideration. The group is quite large, and one of the things that it kind of shares that is this slightly uncomfortable disjunction between the sort of skill in the execution of the faces and the slightly uncomfortable proportions of the figures and placement of the figures. And as a kind of final question to you all, is whether this could be an interesting kind of legacy of the training that Lockie would have received from Nicholas Hilliard as a miniature painter.